When my fiancé, Daniel, proposed, he slipped a simple gold band onto my finger. It wasn't flashy, but it was elegant, timeless. I loved it instantly because it was us, genuine and uncomplicated. When I showed it to my sister, Emily, she burst out laughing. "Couldn't he afford a diamond?" she sneered. I felt the sting but brushed it off, knowing Daniel wasn't one for showy gestures. I still remember that evening as if it were frozen in the soft amber light of memory, the kind of moment that doesn't shout but quietly settles into your heart. The proposal wasn't planned in some grand or cinematic way. There were no rose petals scattered across a five-star restaurant floor, no string quartet waiting in the corner, no photographer hidden behind a curtain. It was just us, on the old wooden bench overlooking the lake near his apartment. The air was cool, scented with pine, and the faint trace of rain that had fallen earlier that afternoon. Daniel had been uncharacteristically quiet that evening. He held my hand, tracing small circles on my palm, and I remember thinking he was lost in one of his thoughtful moods, the ones that made me fall in love with him in the first place. When he finally turned to me, his eyes were soft and steady. He said my name the way he always did when he wanted to tell me something important, gently, like it was something sacred. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring. No speech, no theatrics, just a quiet, heartfelt, "Olivia, will you marry me?" I didn't even let him finish the sentence before I nodded, tears already spilling down my cheeks. I could hardly see the ring through my blurred vision, but when he slipped it onto my finger, the simplicity of it caught me off guard. It wasn't what people might call spectacular. No diamond, no intricate design. Just a thin, polished band of gold that seemed to glow softly even in the fading light. But to me, it was perfect, because Daniel had never been the kind of man who needed to prove his love through extravagance. He showed it in quieter ways, through the way he remembered how I liked my coffee, the way he stayed up with me when I couldn't sleep, the way he listened when I rambled about things that didn't matter to anyone else. That ring, in its simplicity, felt like him, honest, steadfast, and real. Later that night, when I got home, I couldn't stop staring at it. I turned my hand over and over, watching the light play off the gold. It felt almost symbolic, like a small, shining promise that didn't need anything more. It wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was just us. The next day, I was eager to share the news with my family. My parents were thrilled, and their joy filled the room like sunlight. But when I showed Emily, her reaction was nothing like I'd expected. She burst out laughing, that sharp, ringing laugh she had when she thought she was being clever. Her eyes flicked down at my hand, and the corner of her lips curled in mockery. "Couldn't he afford a diamond?" she sneered. For a split second, I froze. It felt like her words had cut through the delicate bubble of happiness I'd been floating in. My cheeks burned. I wasn't angry at her, not at first, just disappointed. Emily had always been the kind of person who measured worth by how things looked. She loved labels, designer bags, cars with badges that screamed money. She'd once told me that love was only as real as the ring that came with it. I wanted to tell her she was wrong. That love wasn't about the sparkle of a stone or the price tag that came with it. That some of the most beautiful things in life don't need to be seen to be felt. But as she stood there, arms crossed, amusement glittering in her eyes, I realized it wouldn't matter. Emily didn't understand love the way I did. So, I just smiled faintly and said nothing. "I mean," she went on, twisting her own ring, a diamond-studded piece from her latest boyfriend, "I guess it's minimalistic." The way she said it made the words sound like an insult wrapped in politeness. I felt the sting, a dull ache beneath my ribs, but brushed it off, knowing Daniel wasn't one for showy gestures. That thought grounded me, reminded me of who we were, and why I'd said yes. That night, I sat on my bed and thought about her reaction. For a brief moment, I wondered if Daniel might have felt pressured, if maybe he doubted whether I would have wanted something more extravagant. The thought made me sad, not because I wanted a diamond, but because I never wanted him to think he needed to prove his love through anything material. The truth was, the ring wasn't just gold. It was a story, ours. It was every late-night talk, every quiet walk home, every time he made me laugh when I wanted to cry. It was the embodiment of years of friendship that had gently turned into love. When I looked at it, I didn't see something lacking. I saw everything that mattered. But still, Emily's laughter lingered in my mind. I tried not to let it, but it echoed in the quiet moments, a reminder of how differently we saw the world. She was my sister, and I loved her, but sometimes it felt like we lived on opposite sides of a glass wall. She could see the surface of my life, but not the depth. As the days passed, I noticed how people's eyes would glance at my ring when I mentioned I was engaged. Some smiled politely. Others, like Emily, seemed puzzled that there was no glittering stone to admire. And yet, every time I caught Daniel looking at me, that quiet, knowing smile on his face, I felt a warmth that no diamond could ever give me. There was something sacred in the simplicity of that gold band. It wasn't there to impress the world. It was there to bind two souls in something pure. Sometimes, late at night, I'd trace the ring with my thumb, remembering the moment he placed it on my finger. I'd recall the way his hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from sincerity. I knew then, and I know now, that the ring was never about luxury. It was about meaning, about the kind of love that doesn't fade when the lights dim or when people stop looking. Emily wouldn't have understood that then. Maybe she still wouldn't. But that was okay. Because when Daniel looked at me and when I looked down at that simple gold band, I didn't see what was missing. I saw everything we already had. And that, more than anything, made it priceless. Months passed, and the wedding day arrived. I was filled with excitement and calm, ready to begin a new chapter with the man I loved. Emily, on the other hand, strutted in, all glammed up, tossing glances at my modest ring with that same smirk. She had always cared too much about appearances, and I knew she still thought my ring was a joke. The morning of the wedding felt like a dream I had been walking toward for years. The sun poured through the soft lace curtains of my dressing room, coating everything in a honey-colored glow. My wedding dress hung near the window, its ivory fabric swaying gently with the breeze, simple, elegant, and very much like the ring on my finger, timeless. I remember running my fingers across the fabric, feeling its coolness beneath my skin. Everything about that day felt still, as though the world had paused to watch me breathe. My heart wasn't racing with nerves. Instead, it was steady, content, a calm certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Daniel and I had spent months planning the wedding. Not the kind that would make headlines or impress strangers, but one that felt personal. We chose a small garden venue outside the city, surrounded by lilac trees and ivy-covered stone walls. The scent of blooming jasmine lingered in the air, carried by a soft spring wind that made the white ribbons on the chairs flutter like tiny wings. My bridesmaids were laughing, adjusting their dresses, while the photographer quietly moved around the room capturing candid moments. Amid the chatter and laughter, I sat in front of the mirror, watching my reflection. My hair was pinned in a loose bun, a few curls escaping to frame my face. The makeup artist had kept things natural, soft tones, a bit of shimmer, just enough to make me feel radiant without changing who I was. And then, of course, there was the ring. It caught the morning light, reflecting it softly, not with the sharp sparkle of a diamond, but with a warm, gentle gleam. I twisted it between my fingers, smiling to myself. This small circle of gold had carried me through months of planning, decision-making, and the occasional storm of insecurity. Whenever things got stressful, I'd look at it and remember why we were doing all this, because we loved each other, not because we needed to prove anything to anyone. Still, I couldn't deny the small flutter of apprehension I felt at the thought of Emily arriving. Emily was my only sister, 2 years older, and as much as we loved each other, there had always been an unspoken tension between us, a quiet rivalry that neither of us admitted aloud. Where I was content with simplicity, she thrived on spectacle. Her world revolved around glitter, glam, and being the center of attention. Growing up, she was always the one to get noticed first, the louder laugh, the bolder outfit, the bigger presence. And she carried that confidence like a weapon. When she entered the venue that day, I noticed her immediately, and so did everyone else. She swept in as if she owned the place, her heels clicking against the stone floor like punctuation marks announcing her arrival. Her dress shimmered under the sunlight, silver and fitted, designed to catch every eye in the room. Her makeup was immaculate, bold, the kind that dared people to look away. And of course, her eyes found me almost instantly. She glanced at me, or rather at my hand, and there it was again, that smirk. The same one she'd worn months ago when she mocked my engagement ring. That faint lift of her lips that said, "I still don't get it." For a moment, I felt that same familiar sting, the echo of her earlier words. Couldn't he afford a diamond? It had been months, but somehow, those words still floated around like a ghost. I met her gaze and smiled politely, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Inside, though, I couldn't help but feel a strange blend of sadness and amusement. Sadness because she couldn't see the beauty in simplicity, and amusement because she truly believed value came from glitter, not meaning. As she approached to hug me, her perfume, sharp and floral, filled the air. "You look lovely," she said, though her tone was more observation than compliment. Her eyes flicked once more toward my ring, and I caught the subtle narrowing of her gaze, the unspoken judgment. "Thank you," I said softly, smiling. I didn't bother defending my choice. I didn't need to. Behind her, my mother watched the exchange with the kind of quiet understanding that only mothers have. She gave me a reassuring nod, the same one she'd given me countless times as a child when I'd come home hurt by Emily's teasing. It was her silent way of saying, "You know who you are. Don't let her shake you." As the ceremony time drew near, I stepped outside for a moment to breathe. The garden was bathed in golden light. The guests' murmurs drifted through the open air, mingling with the rustle of leaves. I could see the archway ahead, covered in white roses and eucalyptus, where Daniel would be waiting soon. My heart swelled with love and anticipation. Every thought of Emily faded as I imagined walking down that aisle. Still, part of me couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. I could picture her sitting among the guests, her manicured fingers fidgeting, her eyes scanning the crowd. Maybe she thought the event was too small, too modest, not grand enough for her taste. Maybe she pitied me for not having chandeliers or champagne towers or a 10-tier cake. But what she didn't understand was that I didn't want those things. I wanted intimacy, laughter, the warmth of family and friends, the joy of looking into Daniel's eyes and knowing that every moment was real, not staged for a photograph. As I stood there, feeling the wind brush against my veil, I realized something profound. I had outgrown the need to explain myself. I didn't need Emily's approval. I didn't need anyone's. When the coordinator called for everyone to take their seats, I turned back toward the doors, my heart light. My father was waiting there, his eyes misty with pride. He took my hand, squeezed it, and whispered, "You're glowing, sweetheart." And I was. Not because of the dress or the flowers or the ring, though I loved all of them. I was glowing because I was loved, deeply, purely, and without conditions. As I walked toward the garden, I caught one last glimpse of Emily through the window. She was standing near the aisle, adjusting her hair, her reflection shimmering in a decorative mirror. Her expression was unreadable for a moment, pride, maybe envy, maybe confusion. But I smiled to myself, because I knew one day she'd understand. Maybe not today, maybe not even soon, but one day she'd realize that love isn't about spectacle, it's about substance. And that sometimes the most beautiful things in life don't need to shine to be seen. The music began to play. I took my father's arm, inhaled deeply, and stepped forward, toward the life waiting for me. But her confidence faltered when the officiant introduced my husband, Daniel Carter, CEO of the very company she worked for. Her jaw dropped. I caught her eyes widening as realization sank in. It was a moment I would never forget, the shock, the disbelief, the regret that flashed across her face. The moment came like the soft crackle before a storm, quiet, almost invisible, yet carrying the weight of something inevitable. The ceremony had been perfect so far. The garden was wrapped in sunlight, The breeze carried the faint scent of lilies, and laughter drifted between the rows of guests like a familiar melody. I stood beside Daniel, our hands intertwined, my heart steady and overflowing. Everything felt surreal. The vase, the soft murmur of friends and family, the gentle hum of life unfolding exactly as it should. I remember glancing up at Daniel and seeing the hint of a smile tug at the corner of his lips, that same look he gave me when something amused him quietly. And then it happened. The officiant's voice, calm and clear, echoed through the garden. "And now, by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. It is my great pleasure to introduce Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Carter." But he didn't stop there. As part of his formal introduction, he added, "Daniel Carter, CEO of Carter Enterprises." The words hung in the air for a split second, just long enough for me to feel the shift. I didn't even have to look at Emily right away to know the moment she heard it. It was as though the entire garden had taken a collective breath, and somewhere among the guests, a single person's world tilted off balance. When I finally turned my head, I found her. She was sitting in the second row, her back straight, her manicured hands resting on her lap. Her expression froze in real time. That flawless composure she wore like armor cracked just slightly. Her jaw slackened, her mouth parting ever so slightly. It was the tiniest movement, but it spoke volumes. Her eyes, always sharp, calculating, darted between Daniel and me, searching, as if trying to process what she'd just heard. I watched her blink once, twice, as realization washed over her face like a cold wave. Daniel Carter,
CEO.
The very man whose emails she probably received, whose name she'd seen printed on company letterheads, whose decisions had rippled through the halls of the office she worked in. The same man she'd assumed was just some guy who couldn't afford a diamond ring. Her expression was a portrait of disbelief, layered with something deeper, humiliation. I knew that look. I'd seen it before, though never this raw. It was the look of someone who had misjudged, underestimated, and now stood face to face with the truth. For months, she had carried that smugness like a crown, laughing at my simple ring, my modest wedding plans, my quiet confidence. And now, as the officiant's words echoed in the air, I could almost see her mind replaying every mocking comment she had ever made. Her smirk was gone. In its place was a trembling silence, the kind that follows realization. I caught her eyes widening as realization sank in, and for a brief moment, our gazes locked. I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel triumph. What I felt was peace. A deep, steady calm that came from knowing I never needed to prove her wrong. The truth had done it for me. It was a moment I would never forget. The shock, the disbelief, the regret that flashed across her face. It all happened in seconds, yet I could have painted every expression she wore as if I had studied it for years. I had spent my entire life watching Emily command attention, walking into rooms and owning them effortlessly. She had always been the one with the louder voice, the grander stories, the bigger presence. And for the first time, she was the one caught off guard, speechless, small. Daniel, standing beside me, must have noticed too. He gave my hand a gentle squeeze, subtle, knowing. When I looked up at him, I saw the faintest glimmer of amusement in his eyes. It wasn't arrogance, not even pride, just quiet acknowledgement. He had met Emily before, once, at a family dinner where she'd spent most of the evening talking about herself and barely hiding her judgment. He'd been polite, even kind, but I had seen the flicker of understanding in his gaze then. He knew exactly what kind of person she was. Now, as the officiant continued, Daniel glanced toward her briefly, then back at me, the corner of his mouth curving just slightly. It wasn't a smirk, it was something more restrained, a silent exchange between us that said, "She knows now." The ceremony moved on, applause, cheers, the rush of music, but for me, that moment stood still, carved into the day like a hidden engraving only I could see. When we walked down the aisle, flower petals fluttering in the air, I felt light. Not because Emily had been humbled, but because the truth had revealed itself without my needing to say a word. As we made our way toward the reception area, guests gathered to congratulate us. I could see Emily standing off to the side, still pale, her expression carefully rearranged into polite composure. But her eyes, those told the real story. Every time they flicked toward Daniel, I saw the flicker of disbelief return, as though she still couldn't reconcile the man she dismissed with the title she now knew. When she finally approached, her steps were slower than usual, tentative. Emily never hesitated, not in heels, not in life, but that day she did. Her voice, usually crisp and confident, faltered when she spoke. You never said. I knew what she meant. She was right. I hadn't said. I hadn't mentioned his title, his position, his wealth. Not once. Because it had never mattered to me. It wasn't who he was that I fell in love with, it was how he loved me. And that was something no title could ever define. Later, as we posed for photos, I glanced at her again. She stood among the guests, smiling too brightly, laughing a little too loudly, trying to reclaim the confidence that had slipped through her fingers. But every time she caught sight of my ring, that simple gold band, her smile faltered. Because now she understood. It wasn't cheap. It wasn't plain. It was meaningful. It was a quiet kind of wealth, the kind that didn't scream, but whispered truths only genuine hearts could hear. The sunlight glimmered off the ring as I lifted my bouquet. I could almost feel its warmth, not from the gold, but from everything it represented. Love. Humility. Truth. Emily might have been the one who always sought perfection, but in that moment, I realized that simplicity had its own kind of power. The power to silence arrogance, to reveal character, to humble pride without a single word spoken. That day, I learned something about love and life that would stay with me forever. You never need to prove the worth of what's real. The world will see it eventually, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. And Emily? She saw it that day. The look on her face told me everything. The ceremony had ended, but the air still hummed with joy. Laughter floated through the garden, mingling with the soft music of a string quartet. The scent of roses lingered, and the golden light of late afternoon wrapped everything in warmth. I stood with Daniel, surrounded by family and friends, the weight of his hand steady on my back, grounding, comforting, familiar. But as the crowd began to disperse toward the reception area, I saw her. Emily stood a few feet away, frozen in place, as if the earth beneath her heels had suddenly become uncertain. The confident poise she'd carried earlier, the lifted chin, the perfect smile, the air of superiority was gone. In its place was a fragile stillness I'd never seen in her before. She looked smaller somehow, like the world had shifted and she didn't quite know how to stand in it anymore. When her eyes found mine, I could see the battle happening behind them. Pride against guilt, disbelief against realization. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her silver clutch bag, and for a brief moment, I almost pitied her. Almost. She began to walk toward me, her steps hesitant. Each one seemed to cost her something, a layer of confidence stripped away with every inch she closed between us. When she finally reached me, her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together, as though she were struggling to find the right words. After the ceremony, she approached me, pale and trembling. You never said. Her voice cracked just a little on the last word. It wasn't just shock that colored her tone. It was regret. Real, heavy regret. The kind that doesn't come from being caught, but from realizing how wrong you've been. I smiled sweetly. You never asked. The words left my mouth with a calm that even surprised me. Not spiteful, not cruel, just true. I had no desire to humiliate her. I didn't need to. The truth had already done that far better than I ever could. Emily blinked, her mouth opening as if to say something else, but no words came. Her gaze fell briefly to my hand, to the ring she'd once mocked so casually. The same ring that now, in her eyes, seemed transformed. I saw her swallow hard, her expression faltering as if she finally understood everything that simple band represented: love, humility, and a quiet strength she'd never noticed before. Daniel stepped closer, ever the gentleman. His expression was warm but edged with that quiet amusement he could never quite hide. "Emily," he greeted, his tone polite but measured. "I'm glad you could make it." She managed a weak smile. "Of course. It was beautiful." Her voice wavered, her usual confidence replaced with an awkward stiffness. Daniel nodded graciously, his hand still resting at the small of my back. I felt the subtle squeeze, his silent way of saying it's all right, let her be. He didn't need to say a word. His presence alone was enough. I watched Emily stammer through small talk, her sentences halting and unsure. She asked questions she didn't mean, gave compliments she didn't feel, and laughed at things that weren't funny, all in a desperate attempt to find her footing again. The same woman who had once mocked my ring now couldn't seem to look at it without faltering. Every ounce of her earlier arrogance was gone. For years, Emily had believed that power was measured by possessions, by how big the diamond, how fancy the car, how lavish the dress. But standing there, she looked like someone who had just realized that all those things could crumble in an instant when faced with something real. And Daniel, calm, kind, unbothered, only made that truth shine brighter. He treated her with courtesy, never smugness, though I caught that faint glint of amusement in his eyes, the kind that said he understood exactly what was happening. He had always carried himself with quiet confidence, and that, more than any title or wealth, was what made him stand out. As the conversation stumbled on, I found myself watching her differently, not as my sister, not as my critic, but as a woman suddenly stripped of her illusions. She was seeing me, perhaps for the first time, not as the simpler sibling, not as the one who settled, but as someone who had chosen love for what it truly was. Guests passed by, offering congratulations and kind words, but Emily remained there for a few moments longer, as if unsure how to leave gracefully. She kept glancing down at my hand, and I could almost hear the thoughts swirling in her mind. The ring hadn't changed. It was the same gold band Daniel had slipped onto my finger that quiet evening by the lake. But the way she saw it had changed completely. That simple gold band, suddenly, didn't look so cheap anymore. It looked priceless. And in that moment, I realized something profound. Value doesn't come from what the world sees, but from what it represents to you. That ring wasn't valuable because of its price. It was valuable because of what it meant, because of the love that had chosen it. I reached out and hugged her lightly. She didn't hug back right away, but after a moment, her arms wrapped around me, hesitant and trembling. It wasn't the kind of embrace sisters share in joy. It was softer, almost like an apology she didn't know how to put into words. When she finally pulled away, she whispered something I barely caught. I didn't know. I smiled again, this time with warmth. Now you do. Her eyes glistened, though she blinked the tears away quickly. She muttered something about needing a drink and walked off toward the bar, her silver dress shimmering under the fading sunlight. As I watched her go, Daniel turned to me with that familiar, knowing smile. "You handled that well," he murmured. I looked down at my ring once more, the golden circle gleaming softly in the evening light. "I didn't need to do anything," I said quietly. It spoke for itself. And it had. That night, as the stars appeared and the laughter of our guests filled the air, I caught one last glimpse of Emily across the garden, alone for a moment, staring at her reflection in a window. She looked thoughtful, almost fragile. And for the first time in years, I didn't see competition between us. I saw understanding beginning to bloom. The kind that comes only after truth humbles pride, and love reveals what really matters.